Hey guys, it's me again. I bet you didn't think you'd see me again so quickly. But spring break is about to start, and the news is changing very quickly about everything going on with COVID 19 and the quarantine. You guys might have heard that we likely will be closed for the rest of the school year. We don't know yet what that means for your grades for the semester. The policies are being made, sort of kind of being made up as we go along since this is unprecedented. But I wanted to go ahead and kind of give you one last look at the legacy of the New Deal, which we were studying, and connect it once again to everything that's happening right now, or at least I'm going to try to. And I hope you guys can see those connections and make some of your own. So today we're going to talk about the legacy of the New Deal, or tonight, I should say, as I'm coming to you live from my couch. So these are all images of some of the alphabet soup, you know, um, different programs that FDR created in the New Deal, like the WPA and FERA and the NRA, not the gun one, the different NRA, the TVA, the FDIC, the Social Security Act, and all these things. But what the New Deal really leaves behind is a totally changed relationship that we, the people, have with the state, with the government itself. So let's talk about FDR, who is the president here. First of all, he's very popular in his first 2 years as president. He does go on to be elected 8 times, and he ends up guiding America through most of the Civil War. He died a few months before it officially ended, but he was elected 4 times. In the first 2 years of his presidency, when he first creates the New Deal, he created 2 million jobs in 2 years, which was impressive, but it still wasn't enough. Barely made a dent in the Depression. That's how bad the Depression was. 10 million people were still unemployed, and even with all of that expense and effort that Franklin D. Roosevelt puts into the New Deal, the nation's income was still only half of what it had been before the Depression. So the Depression will not actually end until World War II pulls America into the war and everybody has to go to work. But we still question today, how valuable was the New Deal? Was it worth it to go into all of that debt? Was it worth it to strengthen the reach of the government's hands into all of our lives? Some people will say yes, some people will say no. It's not for me to say. I want you guys to decide that for yourselves. After all, many of the aspects of the New Deal you will inherit yourself, and just as your parents and your grandparents inherited them. So, why did people criticize the New Deal, and why do they still criticize it today? Well, criticism came from the right and the left. Let's start first with the right, the Republicans. Remember, FDR is a Democrat, and he was a fairly liberal Democrat, or at least for his time anyway. And the Republicans criticized him because he was a lot of spending. Essentially, America was going into debt, deficit spending money we didn't have to practically create jobs out of thin air. Too much economic regulation as well. It was the complete opposite of laissez faire. And so, of course, a lot of Republicans who have favored laissez faire since its inception in America were very much against it. And many of them even believed that the New Deal and all of the regulation that came with it was actually stifling the economic comeback. I don't know if that's true or not, but certainly people believed it was true. It might have been true, but we have no way of really knowing. We do know, though, that when laissez-faire was attempted by Hoover, uh, it didn't it didn't work at that time. I'll let you guys, kind of make up your mind about that one. But even from the left, people were criticizing FDR. Now, even though FDR himself was on the left side of the political spectrum, people even further to the left, the socialists in America, were also criticizing him because they actually thought that the New Deal didn't do enough. Many of them thought that the New Deal just created jobs, but the jobs didn't pay very much. There was still poverty, And a lot of these people believe that really what we need to do is we need to shift wealth from rich people to poor people. This sort of proletariat struggle against the bourgeoisie that Karl Marx talks about. He wasn't. These socialists were not talking about a revolution and overthrowing the government and all that stuff like what happened in Russia, but they were just simply saying that we should do more to shift wealth into the hands of the poor from the hands of the rich. And then there were people in the middle who appreciated Roosevelt's efforts for what they were. His biggest critics, though, let's talk about some of these guys. You might have heard of some of them. Some of them are kind of famous, and they're in your history book. There's this guy named Huey Long. He's pretty famous. He was the governor of Louisiana, and he was known for getting involved with some pretty shady characters in the mafia, organized crime, and stuff like that. But he was also a champion of the poor. He stood up for poor people in Louisiana. However, he was also super corrupt and a bit of a criminal himself. But he advocated for this thing called the Share Our Wealth Society. And he wanted to basically tax the rich and give it to the poor. He was sort of like a Robin Hood type of guy, although he really was kind of a crooked dude. There was a Catholic priest named Father Charles Coughlin, and he actually believed that the government needs to take more radical reforms in helping the poor. There was a California doctor named Dr. Francis Townsend, and he believed that Social Security was not enough. He wanted the government to just automatically give money to all retired persons who reached the age of 60. This is not the same thing as Social Security. This was like a much bigger check. Now, if you think any of these things sound familiar right now because of everything that's going on, you guys might have heard that recently the government passed a multi-trillion dollar, trillion with a T, stimulus package. And one of the stipulations is that it's going to give certain people in America over the age of 18, so long as they are citizens and they meet the financial requirements, they're going to get a one-time check for $1,200 plus another $500 for each child or dependent that they have. This is unprecedented. We've never been through anything like this before, but it's not the first time that we have talked about giving people money in times of crisis. I'll get to that a little bit later. Other people also criticized the WPA, which was unquestionably the biggest project of the New Deal. So the WPA, or Works Progress Administration, was in effect from 1935 to 1941. It was the largest public works program of the New Deal. It created by itself overall throughout those years 8.5 million jobs. But some of those jobs were temporary or seasonal, and they didn't pay especially much. So just because you had a job didn't mean that you were doing well. It just meant you were not unemployed. It meant you were employed. But you were not going to get rich through a WPA job. It was essentially something to keep you fed and perhaps with a roof over your head, which was what was necessary at the time. It cost the government a total of $11 billion. In today's money, that may not seem like a lot, but back then that was quite a bit. What did the WPA do? Well, it built roads and bridges and airports, parks. You might remember from the assignment you just did, it even paid artists to create works of art like murals and sculptures that would be enjoyed by the public. Even playwrights and writers wrote plays that would be performed for the public, often for free. This was a way of supporting the arts as well. One of the projects that's really impressive is that some of the WPA journalists that had been out of work actually even recorded stories of surviving slaves and Civil War and World War I war veterans, because in the 1930s there were still people alive who had once been slaves or even Civil War vets. So I thought that was pretty cool. But why did people criticize the WPA? I don't know if you can see this cartoon here, but it's a political cartoon, before memes, it was the political cartoons. And these are men all holding shovels, standing around and looking kind of happy and sort of socializing, but they're not actually doing any digging. Meanwhile, the guy in the back is digging, and the guys are making fun of him for actually working. They're saying, oh, it's his first day. He's certainly making a fool of himself. as if like, hey, you're not actually supposed to do any work. So a lot of people actually criticized the WPA because they thought the government just kind of paid men to stand around and look busy with a shovel. Probably true also. I mean, any kind of government funded project like this probably is going to include some government waste and inefficiency. That's kind of the way it goes sometimes. So again, let me review this. So the right wing criticized the New Deal because it gave the federal government, not only was it so expensive, but it gave the federal government way too much power and it regulated business way too tightly. One thing that FDR did that really freaked out people, especially on the right, I mean, he was popular, but he did sometimes go a bit far, and some criticized him for wanting to be too powerful. Some actually told him that he was playing God, that he was trying to, move heaven and earth himself just to end this depression. Maybe he was, but one of the things that actually got him into a bit of trouble was his court packing plan. So I've actually included an assignment in Google Classroom that you're going to be doing on this. It's a short one. You're just going to read his defense of his court packing plan and answer a couple questions. But what does this mean? Well, this means that FDR was getting really annoyed with the fact that the Supreme Court was starting to declare some of his projects unconstitutional. For example, the AAA, not the car insurance people, but the AAA, which was the Agricultural Adjustment Act. This was the one that had actually paid farmers not to produce food, or in some cases, even to destroy some of their crops. This was to try to regulate farm and crop prices and food prices. A lot of people were outraged by that. How could you pay the farmers not to farm? So, almost seen as if like some sort of welfare or something like that. So, when it was declared unconstitutional, FDR tries to change the actual makeup of the Supreme Court by packing the court with judges that were younger than the age of 70, because if they are younger, FDR thinks they'll be more relevant, more hip to the times, more likely to agree with FDR. He thought the older judges were conservative and were more likely to be against everything that he was doing. So what he wanted to do was he wanted to actually change the number of justices on the Supreme Court from 9 to 15. Think about what that would mean if a president could do that, because then that would automatically give him the power to appoint 6 new judges straight off the bat. A lot of people thought he was starting to act like a king more than a president. So people didn't like that. Also, the amount of money the government was spending was absolutely alarming and outrageous at a time when we didn't really have any. It just seemed impossible that we could be digging ourselves into that much debt. Again, from the left wing, they thought it was just insufficient help. The wealth needed to really shift into the hands of the poor from the rich. So socialism was definitely a specter that was haunting Europe, in the words of, or I should say America, in the words of Karl Marx. Some of the people on the left wanted to nationalize banks. That means that they wanted banks to be taken over by the state and not be privately owned anymore. This would totally get rid of laissez-faire, just about, and it would also cause a lot of inflation. Other leftists wanted the government to give welfare checks for the elderly, especially. We've been talking a lot about the elderly and their needs with this coronavirus outbreak, since they are the most vulnerable in economic crises. Since they don't work, their retirement plans are in the stock market, which is going crazy right now. So, and obviously their health is, not good, so they're susceptible to these diseases. So it's interesting that the elderly become a concern in both of these crises. The New Deal was obviously always coming into question by the Supreme Court. We may see in the very near future some of the things that are happening now, that the government is doing now, possibly might be questioned or might go before the Supreme Court for some sort of new interpretation. Things are going to change legally, politically, economically, and socially as a result of this crisis. But the other main legacy, the big thing that this has left behind, that the New Deal has left behind, is something called the Wagner Act. It's also something that establishes the National Labor Relations Board, labor as in workers. Suddenly, workers were seen as important. Now, you might notice a parallel in the current coronavirus quarantine, pandemic, and economic crisis. Suddenly, we're starting to use the term essential worker. Who are the essential workers? Hospital workers, doctors, nurses, obviously, but also grocery store clerks, janitors, and cleaning staff, and people who cook food in restaurants, and delivery service people like Amazon delivery service and postal workers. Suddenly, these are the essential workers that are going to literally keep the country running in its very foundation. I mean, sure, you have your corporates and office jobs that can work from home, but without the essential workers, many of us might even die. It's that serious. So, so suddenly, all of a sudden, we're looking at like a whole new definition of work and labor and who these important workers are. There's even recently been talk of grocery store workers going on strike because they're putting their lives at risk for working for us during this quarantine. So the same thing happens during the Great Depression. Suddenly, workers become essential. Having a job became central to one's existence, as sad as that kind of sounds. And so suddenly, workers' rights become very important. And the Wagner Act is important because, highlight this one, guys, it gave workers the right to have a union and be protected. Without the Wagner Act, workers might not have the legal right to unionize, to go on strike if necessary, to ask for better wages and better conditions. Today, unions are regularly recognized by companies and have real bargaining power. The other major legacy is Social Security. Now, people criticize Social Security all the time, but you got to think back to what it was like before Social Security and how old people used to survive. Will Social Security still be around when I retire or when you retire? I can't say for sure. It's been drained quite a bit, but we all pay Social Security taxes. It goes into a massive fund, and then when you retire, you get some Social Security checks. Your grandparents, if they have retired, they probably have some of these checks themselves. Can you live off Social Security? No, but it has provided a lifeline for the elderly. Basically, it's money you get when you're old and you retire, and you pay into it your entire life from the moment you get your very first job, whether you're 16 or 18 or 20 or whatever. You start paying into social security taxes. When you're old and decide to retire past the age of 60, I think, you start getting a check from the government. Now, I want to remind you, it is your money. You paid into it, now you get it back. This is the government's way of ensuring that you have a pension when you're old. It's one of the most important pieces of legislation that has ever been passed in American history. Very few countries had ever passed something like this before. Some countries in Europe had passed something like this. And even then, it was done as an emergency measure. So this is pretty notable in history. You can talk to your grandparents about Social Security and what they think about it and whether or not they value it. They probably have a better opinion of it than any of us do. Now, there's questions about it too, because there are some people who can get Social Security who don't pay into it. For example, stay-at-home moms who never work, they get Social Security too. Is that right for them to get it? In my opinion, yes, because they are still providing an essential service to the country. They're raising children and taking care of family, which is the foundation of any community. But of course that brings up questions about, well, now who gets to pull out of Social Security and who doesn't? It does come out of our payroll taxes. You get the money again because we've all paid into it. You do have a legal, moral, and political right to Social Security money. Essentially, though, what this is saying is that the government is responsible for people who cannot work. Who cannot work are people who are elderly, people who are disabled, or children. So, therefore, this is basically the government now becoming responsible for those who cannot help themselves. This is kind of the opposite of that rugged individualism that we've talked about in class before. where you're supposed to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and just take care of yourself no matter what. Things changed. The perspective changed during the Great Depression, just as our perspective is changing now. Okay, the other big impact that this has, that the New Deal has, is on the Democratic Party. Let's talk about the Democratic Party for a second and look at this funny picture. You'll notice it has presidents. Some are in the forefront, like Bill Clinton's in the front there, and then Barack Obama and JFK. Those are three of our most prominent Democratic presidents in the 20th century. In the background there is FDR. But notice who's in the very, very back. Andrew Jackson. So what does Andrew Jackson have in common with people like Barack Obama or Bill Clinton? Doesn't seem like they have that much in common. That's the point. The New Deal really changes the face and the agenda of the Democratic Party. Remember that the Democratic Party started as a bunch of racist Southerners whose main agenda was to oppress newly freed African Americans. They had supported the establishment of the KKK, and really resembled something that we would not recognize today. Today, the Democratic Party has a whole new platform, and they often are the party that stand for the government's responsibility towards the less fortunate. Also, the Democratic Party, if you look at JFK and Barack Obama, those are presidents that represent the struggle for civil rights. The Democratic Party is much more popular amongst African American voters today. Interesting, considering the fact that the Democratic Party was once the party of the KKK. So times sure have changed. Who actually starts this big shift? It really starts with Woodrow Wilson, a progressive Democrat. Changes further under FDR when he, as a Democrat, makes the government responsible for people who cannot work. And then under JFK, he was also a Democrat, he became the civil rights president. So you can see how much things have changed. Women also have a tendency to vote more often for Democratic candidates. Not always, but many times. Farmers, not so much. Lately, farmers have they tend to be socially very conservative, but farmers have traditionally been voters of the Democratic Party because they benefit from the government's subsidies for farmers. Workers, the working class, labor unions, that kind of thing, have a tendency more to be Democrats. Immigrants as well, and progressives in general. So as well as academics or intellectuals, especially at the university level. This is not obviously like an overall blanket statement. Clearly there are exceptions. This is not to say that all intellectuals and immigrants and farmers and women and African Americans vote for Democrats. That's not what I'm saying at all. But statistically, the Democratic Party is more popular with these groups. So what the New Deal did was it really redefines what it means to be liberal. Liberals used to be very pro laissez-faire and against government regulation, and that is no longer the case. Liberals have a tendency to be more for regulation, and they also have a tendency now to want to stand up for civil liberties as opposed to once being the party of the KKK. There is a video on my website I'll show you later that I would like for you guys to watch about how the Democratic Party went from the party of Andrew Jackson to the party of Barack Obama. Quite a 180. Okay, so this basically means that the government now has a whole new role in America and in our lives personally. I mean, the New Deal created a new relationship between government and between the American people. It also meant that state governments had to look to federal governments for more funding. If you watch the news today is April 1st, 2020. If you watch the news today, you might have seen our governor, Gavin Newsom, governor of California, making a huge speech about what to expect now that we're probably going to be out of school for the rest of the year. The guidelines for quarantine are being expanded. But he has also been working very closely with the federal government, that of Donald Trump. And it's interesting because Gavin Newsom and Donald Trump don't get along. Gavin Newsom is very much a liberal Democrat, and Donald Trump is not. And their personalities have clashed, not just their political values, but their personalities. They have been downright, kind of feisty with each other fairly recently in the past year. And now they are working together, and Gavin Newsom has extended an open hand to President Trump and has, because he is, of course, California, as well as every state government, is badly in need of more federal funding to buy things like ventilators and masks and protective gear for hospital workers and all that kind of thing. So the same thing happened with the New Deal. The state governments were forced now to look to the federal government. Do you guys remember at the beginning of the year when we were learning about American history and the founding fathers wanted it to be more like strong state governments and a weak federal government? Well, that is not where we are now. Also, the New Deal does give Americans a sense of security that the government will work on their behalf. I mean, look at us now. During a time of crisis like this, who do we look to try to solve the crisis? We look to the government. That's, just as we did during the times of the Great Depression. Essentially, this really means that Americans look for what's called the broker state. Can the government actually resolve conflicts between groups? For example, if there is a conflict between, like, let's say, immigrants and farmers, or, labor unions and business leaders, they often will look to the government to come in and be the broker and try to resolve those conflicts. Some people view the government also as the provider of the safety net. Can the government provide safeguards and relief in case of an emergency such as this? I mean, that's who we look at now. So what does the New Deal mean for today's pandemic and quarantine crisis? Take a look at this. So this is about that $2 trillion stimulus package that the government has just recently passed. And if you're over the age of 18, you might start seeing a check in the mail addressed to you fairly soon, I think. So what this does is it offers unemployment benefits for people who lost their job because of the economic crash that just happened. And it also increases the amount of money that you're going to get if you're on unemployment by $600 per person. Now, I got to say, though, this is me coming out and criticizing this. $600 isn't going to do much. Not in the Bay Area. It's a small amount considering how much it costs to live. That being said, it is still an increase. So see, we can still criticize it. We can still look, and some people will say, well, that's an outrageous amount of money for every unemployed person. And some people will say, well, that's not going to do anything. You can't live on $600 a month. Anyway, on top of that, most adults are going to receive about $1,200. You'll get $500 for each dependent who's under the age of 16. College students who are claimed as dependents by their parents or guardians don't qualify for the $1,200. So this is where some people will again criticize this stimulus package. If you're a parent of a college student, you're probably paying a lot of money for them to go to college. You could probably really use that extra money, especially if you have lost your job. So it really doesn't make sense that parents of college students can't claim them as dependents when actually those college students are costing the parents a lot of money. Undocumented immigrants are not eligible for these benefits. Legal permanent residents and immigrants are legally eligible for these. Remember, though, undocumented immigrants often do pay taxes, but they will not reap the benefits of this stimulus package. Also, the amount that you receive depends on the level of your income, so that's kind of also strange. Some people think like, well, shouldn't it just be the same for everyone? I mean, if it's not, then what does that start to resemble? Also, if you earn more than $99,000 a year, you don't qualify for any money. Now, some people again might say, but what if you lose that job? Now you're not making any money. Don't you kind of need that? So there's all kinds of other items in the bill. Schools are going to continue to be funded for now. It includes $13 billion. It also goes to help with nutrition programs, and it will also defer federal student loan payments until September 30th. Again, some people might look at that and say, how do we know that this is going to be over by September 30th? It's kind of weird to put a date on these things when we don't actually know when this crisis is going to end. But some people might say, well, this is better than nothing. There are some countries that are going through the same thing we're going through right now, and their governments aren't giving them not a thing. Okay, so what is this? What else does this mean? Well, don't forget, you guys, it's an election year, so things have gotten kind of unpredictable at the point. As of today, the news is looking very bleak. I'm not going to lie. Over 200,000 Americans have COVID-19 or have tested positive for it. We are now leading the world. We are number one in the number of coronavirus cases. We have more than China or Italy. Today, a really depressing thing on the news. Some people said that as many as 240,000 Americans might die in the United States because of this virus. The economy is on a steady downward spiral. Every now and then there's a few good rally days, but then it just crashes right back down again. So the stock market is really volatile right now. Trump's response has been criticized. Many say that he was slow to respond to the crisis, that he called it a hoax at first. He said that it was going to be down to zero within a few days or weeks or months. Some people are saying that his response was slow because he was too busy with the whole impeachment business. I don't know. I don't work in Washington. But I do know that Trump's response has come into question, and how people perceive his response could affect his electability in this upcoming election. But Democrats also haven't really done or said much. They certainly were supporting this stimulus package, but at the same time, what is the stimulus package really going to do? It's $2 trillion, and how much is it really going to help us when we really need it? They were so intent on defeating Donald Trump in this election that they've been really kind of thrown off course. So here's one thing though. Do you guys remember Andrew Yang? He was running for president. This guy right here. Well, now my face is covering him up. I'm sorry. Andrew Yang. He was running for president as a Democrat, but he dropped out because he didn't have enough support, and no one really knew who he was. And so he dropped out. Now he works for CNN, and he endorsed Joe Biden. This has all happened just within the last couple months. But he ran on basically this idea that we should have universal basic income. He has been saying this forever, that every American over the age of 18 should just automatically get what he called the freedom dividend. We all get $1,000 a month, every month, for our whole lives. And we put that money back into the economy, and we stimulate the economy, and think about what you could do with an extra $1,000 a month. So he believes that this could help reduce poverty immensely. He thinks that many jobs are going to disappear due to automation anyway. So nobody really gave him any credit. No one took him really seriously. And then all of a sudden, people are talking about this $1,000 a month. I mean, suddenly his idea sounds really relevant. But here's the surprising thing. The Republican Party is actually talking about embracing this idea more than the Democratic Party, even though he ran as a Democrat. So, you guys, the Democratic and the Republican parties, they're going to change. I don't know exactly how they're going to change, but this crisis is certainly going to turn them around. So, that being said, guys, I'm giving you a final assignment on this. Go away. Number one, I want you guys to go to my website, to the New Deal, and you guys can watch this video at the very bottom here. It's the box video called From White Supremacy to Barack Obama, the History of the Democratic Party. It's a short video, and it explains what we talked about, how the Democrats have changed as a result of FDR. And then you're also going to go into Google Classroom, and you're going to find this assignment called FDR and Court Packing. You're going to read how FDR defended his plan to pack the Supreme Court. Now, if any president today were to do this, it would cause probably a massive scandal, like huge, because it's basically getting rid of checks and balances. So read what he says and why he says it, and then you're going to answer a few questions and click submit. So that's it for my last final lesson. I haven't done too many of these. I hope you haven't gotten too tired of hearing from me, since it looks like I won't be seeing you for the rest of the school year. I just want to say that I hope you're all healthy and safe, and I wish this was not happening, obviously for many reasons, but I wish you all good health and safety, and I sure hope to see you guys in the fall at Northgate.